Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 149, The Life of Ben Jonson, Part 6, Posterity Pays Every Man His Honour. Last time, I finished with the publication of the first folio of Ben Jonson's collected works. It was a publication that would have raised an eyebrow of many in the literary circles as an unusual move for a living poet. But Jonson always had an eye for the preservation of his work, and by publishing in his lifetime, he could control the legacy. The collection was, in fact, a curated selection, which Jonson almost certainly had a close hand in editing, something else that was unusual for the time. No surprise that poems from his Catholic past were largely omitted, as were early play collaborations, including The Isle of Dogs. Yet, it remained an impressive collection, and helped to cement his position as the leading literary figure in his time. A play that Jonson could have included in his first folio but chose not to was Bartholomew Fair, which had been performed in October 1614, 2 years before the publication of the collection. The play was challenging in some ways and does mark something of a departure for Jonson. Perhaps he felt that it was marking a change in his style and ambition, and therefore might belong better in his next folio, where it did make an appearance in 1631, when Jonson included it in his second folio. Whatever the case, Bartholomew Fair is now usually considered worthy of its place in any limited collection of Jonson plays, but it is somewhat different from his other work. The cast is large, some 40 characters, which presupposes the merging of 2 or 3 acting companies of the time to enable performance. It is less obviously plot-driven than his other plays, but no less intricate for that. Some critics have characterised it as showing a series of loosely related events rather than a coherent plot, but that is a little harsh. However, its first audiences, expecting a plot-driven comedy, were left a little bemused. Jonson told Drummond that he recognised that the play was what we would now call experimental, and he wrote an apology for it, which unfortunately is now lost. Bartholomew Fair includes some contemporary references to matters concerning the finances of the monarchy, which might be another reason for its omission from the first folio. James had continued to spend beyond his allowances, and Parliament was becoming more and more forthright in their attempts to curtail his largesse. Anyone associated with the court, and many outside of it, were aware of the growing tensions between the king and Parliament, some even believing that the issue could cause unrest in the country. A thread concerned with the power of money and the related fortunes of those who have it, who gain it, who lose it, or don't have it, runs throughout the plays, becoming more prominent in the later plays as Jonson himself became more wealthy. However, Jonson seems to have always spent as much as he earned, if not more, enjoying a high lifestyle and generosity towards his friends. It was a lifestyle that was quite reflective of the times, where many fortunes were being made and lost by adventurers, merchants and investors, both at home and abroad. At court, Jonson would have become acquainted with some of these investors and adventurers as they sought funding or favours from the crown. James was actively interested in doing what he could to swell what he regarded as his meagre coffers, and investment by the crown was made in some projects, not all of which were successful. As an example, Jonson is known to have been associated with Sir Willian Cockayne, who had ingratiated himself with James by lending the king money at opportune moments. Cockayne belonged to the Eastland Company, which financed trade and was the main rival to the Adventurers' Company, who held monopolies in undyed and undressed cloth trade, among other things. Cockayne persuaded James that if all cloth was dressed and dyed in England, not only would it provide more jobs at home, but more profitable trade abroad for English cloth. As the Crown took a cut of this income, James was persuaded, and reformed the trading companies in 1614 to accommodate the plan. However, Cockayne had overestimated the quality of English dyeing and dressing, and the Baltic territories that were importing the majority of English cloth returned finished goods and refused to buy more. This caused a crisis in the industry at home, and as the trade collapsed, left the Crown even further in debt. While the Privy Council was still investigating complaints about the new company and the trading system, Cockayne, An alderman of the City of London thought it wise to throw a lavish banquet to thank the king for his support. This was in June 1616, and Jonson was commissioned to provide the entertainment. Jonson's work has not survived, but the celebration was described like this. The king was invited by Alderman Cockayne and the new company of merchant venturers to a dinner in London. They made a great feast, gave him a present of £1,000 in a basin and ewer of gold, which, because it weighed nigh £300 of that value in weight, they made it up in £20 pieces. To the prince also a present. And for the king's better contentment, they presented dyers, weavers with their shuttles, and cloth dressers, speaking by way of an interlude to grace themselves and their industry. After this was presented certain Hamburgians with great-bellied doublets, all drunk, which spake such language as Ben Jonson put into their mouths, only for merriment, but this, they say, is taken so ill that the Lord Ambassador here, Sir Noel Caron, has been with the Lords to complain of it. Caron was the Dutch ambassador to the English court, so clearly the entertainment included not only satire of the dressers and dyers of Hamburg, but some affront to the Dutch as well, another key trading partner for English wool and cloth. Caron was also well liked by the king personally, and another rich individual who had provided significant finance for the court. What is really striking here is not only the close relationship of the crown to the trading projects and individuals, some of whom at least were, in modern parlance, rather dodgy, but the wealth that was lavished on the king for favour, and how closely that tied to foreign and trading policy. Jonson was witness to all of this, and perhaps by this stage was feeling that things were turning a little sour. Such observations fed into his next plays. The Devil is an Ass, his next stage comedy, was presented in autumn 1616 at the Blackfriars Theatre by the King's Men. The play resides in the world of money-making projects and quickly gained wealth. In the play, Jonson suggests that not all of the schemes proposed were entirely legitimate or honest, and he takes particular shots at some of the major projects for the time that planned to drain the fenlands of East Anglia to turn them into productive agricultural land. To Drummond, Jonson reported that he was censured for the play, and changes were ordered at the king's request. Presumably that was some satire on a scheme that the crown had invested in, and it was dutifully removed. A general satire about the draining of the fenland is retained in the printed version of the play, so presumably it was ridicule of a particular project that caused the problem. Jonson's journey to Scotland that I opened this series of episodes with occupied the second half of 1618, and he was not back in London until spring 1619. Drummond wrote him several letters in which he expressed some concern that they would find him safely. It seems that on his return, Jonson moved through several London homes until he settled near Westminster Abbey for the rest of his life. There is no mention of the return to a family home, so either his wife had died by this time or they had separated completely. So, settled in London. That is, apart from the visits he made to the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. The first of these was soon after his return to Scotland, in July 1619, when he went to Oxford to receive an honorary degree. He was presented with that honour by his long-term patron, the Earl of Pembroke, who was Chancellor of the university at the time. Although there is no formal record of similar honours from Cambridge University, Jonson mentioned to Drummond that both universities had graced him, so it seems likely that that was during James's visit to Cambridge in March 1615, when he was similarly bestowed as part of the ceremony of mass conferring of degrees that James undertook. Jonson's return to London marks the beginning of a period where theatre plays a smaller part in his life than previously. Although he continued to provide masks for the court, he seems to have devoted much more of his time to poetry and study. Like many scholars of the time, he built an impressive library of books and manuscripts, with some surviving evidence suggesting that he collected multiple editions of works that particularly interested him. His society was a scholarly one, where the libraries of other similarly minded gentlemen were visited, perused, and borrowed from frequently. Members of this group began to meet regularly at the Apollo Room above the Devil and St Dunstan Tavern in Fleet Street, and became known as the Tribe of Ben. Consciously trying to recreate the Apollo room presided over by the 1st century BCE Roman general and renowned gourmet Lucilius, lavish meals fortified the guests for their discussions and debates. The tavern is long gone now, but the words of welcome written by Jonson and placed over the door are still preserved in the building that replaced the tavern. One night, late in 1623, Jonson's rooms were set on fire, probably from an overturned candle or a spark from the hearth. It destroyed part of his extensive library. He recorded the pain of his loss in a poem called An Execration upon Vulcan, but still he managed to find some humour in the situation. He lists some of the works lost in the fire, including the account of his journey to Scotland, and although it includes poems and plays, the majority are works of scholarship, reflecting his current interests. He was caught up in another house fire a couple of years later and was rescued by a friend and neighbour who wrote in a letter asking him to take better care of his charcoal fire and chimney. House fires were pretty common in Jacobean London, but one wonders how much Jonson's notorious drinking was contributing to his apparently lax behaviour around flames. By this time, Jonson was probably already becoming less mobile, his walk to Scotland now being some 5 years behind him, and he starts to complain in letters about being confined to his rooms more than he would like. The death of James in March 1625 after a short illness gave the court only the slightest pause before plans were being made first for James's funeral, recorded as the greatest funeral that England had ever known, and then for the multiple celebration of the marriage of Prince Charles to Henrietta Maria, the youngest daughter of Henry IV of France, and their coronation. Celebrations in London were extensive. Jonson was employed by the Dutch community in Gracechurch Street, who were responsible for the entertainment around one of the 5 triumphal arches erected for the occasion in the city. In an echo of James's coronation, the procession and celebrations had to be postponed due to a summer outbreak of the plague, and by the time the coronation finally took place, Jonson had written a new play that was just about to open. A subplot in that play concerns the death of a father and an inheritance of a son, suggesting that Jonson was, not surprisingly, much preoccupied with the death of his steadfast patron of many years, and how his fortunes might change under the new regime. In fact, Charles was already well known to Jonson, having acted in court masques, at least one of which Jonson wrote with his glorification in mind, and from that point of view at least, the transition was pretty seamless. Many critics have considered the plays written after Bartholomew Fair as nothing more than work of Jonson's dotage, and largely dismissed them. That is, with the exception of The Staple of the News, which was first registered in February 1626, and was a return to Jonson to the public stage for the first time in a decade. It is a satire on the newspaper and newspaper agency business, which was a new and rapidly growing phenomena in the 1620s. Printed news sheets became very popular. These were developed from printed serials imported from the Netherlands, which gave a Protestant-orientated commentary on the 30 Years' War. By 1622, a London publisher had set up a syndication operation for news serials written in England. The new staple in the play is a parody of these developments. Countering the Protestant tone of the serials may have been part of the motivation for Jonson's choice of subject, as James was urged in many of them to join the fight against Catholic Spain and France. Jonson supported James in his reluctance to join the war, although their motives were probably very different. The main problem for James was that he could not afford to get embroiled in a long and costly war. But Jonson's plays never concentrated on just one strand of satire, and in this case he also poked fun at the new phenomena of capitalism, and returning to another subject that threads through his plays, his annoyance at the misuse of language. During the 1620s, Jonson's health appears to have taken a significant decline. A self-reference to him in The Staple of the News calls him a huge overgrown playmaker, and an engraving of him made in 1627, although celebrating him as the most learned of English poets, depicts him in a sedentary position and looking rather sad. You can see that on the social media postings for this episode. It seems to sum up his evident frustrations as he became more and more housebound through the decade. For a man who always enjoyed the company of others and being the centre of attention, a life that was becoming more and more isolated was, no doubt, a mental problem as much as a physical one. Jonson commented later that by 1628 he was stricken with palsy, which is thought to mean that he had suffered a stroke and had not regained full use of his limbs. But this is not to say that Jonson's intellect and creativity was completely diminished, and he was still capable of producing work that was admired by his contemporaries, and he never lost his satirical bite. In 1628 he was accused of writing some verses in support of a Protestant soldier who had stabbed the Duke of Buckingham, a close confidant of the king. Although the verse is very Jonsonian in style, it is not certain by any means that he did write them, but the very fact that the Attorney General thought he was capable of composing the verse and called him to answer for them tells us that he was still very present, even if he was not physically so. Even into the 1630s, there are mentions in letters of Jonson having visited members of the literary and court circle in their homes. Mostly these were close to Jonson's own home near Westminster Abbey, but again, it is suggestive that he was capable of getting around to some extent and engaging in conversation with people he would have considered his equal intellectually, or, more likely, just below his own level. And there was one more significant role that Jonson was to fulfil. In September 1628, he was appointed Chronologer of the City of London, taking the position that the playwright Thomas Middleton had held until his death. The chronologer's job was to document any memorable acts by the city alderman and occurrences of note in the city. All of his work in this role was to be approved by the Court of Aldermen, and he was paid £33 a year for his efforts. That was a decent sum to add to the income he was receiving from the plays and masques that he was still producing, and his court pension, and, it is assumed, money was the main reason that he agreed to take on that role. However, 2 years later, the Court of Aldermen ordered the Chamberlain to withhold payments. Evidently, Jonson had not produced any of the required work. About the same time, Jonson's presence is recorded as a prominent mourner at the funeral procession of City Grandee Sir John Lemon. That cannot have been an easy walk for him by this time, and it is thought that he was trying to signal to the Court of Aldermen that he was serious in the observance of his civic duties. Friends and patrons continued to be generous towards Jonson, and he continued to spend their money freely, if his frequent references to the paucity of his state are to be taken at face value. The last 10 years of Jonson's life are characterised by requests from him for support and the apparent willingness of many to give him that support. The Archbishop of Canterbury paid him £5 in January 1625 because of his sickness and want, and King Charles sent him £100 shortly after that. The following year, Jonson sent the king a begging poem, and his court pension was increased from £75 a year to £100. Surely, this was enough income for any man, however much a spendthrift. Jonson said to Drummond that, of all his plays, he never gained more than £200. Perhaps this is a grumpy exaggeration, and lest we forget, £200 was no mean sum for the time. However you look at it, Jonson was not poor for all his protestations. Cash flow might have been a constant issue, while his main source of income was the court. As James and then Charles tried to manage their finances, payments to those who supplied the court were often delayed, and Jonson liked to live a generous and high life. It is fair to say that the problem was not his level of income, but his level of spending. Another play, The New Inn, followed in January 1629, performed by the King's Men at the Blackfriars Theatre. The performance is recorded as a catastrophic failure that hissed from the Blackfriars stage. In an epilogue Jonson wrote for the printed edition a few years later, he mentions that the intended performances for the court were abandoned. Jonson was very upset by the failure of the play, writing of it in a later poem called Ode to Himself. Come leave the loathed stage, and the more loathsome age. And he excluded it from his second folio collection. The Magnetic Lady was licensed for performance in October 1632, and again was performed by the King's Men at the Blackfriars. The play was heavily criticised for its attacks on the numerous enemies that Jonson was now able to list. That criticism often coming from those satirised in his work. It seems that Jonson was losing his touch at covering the identity of those he ridiculed. The play didn't fail as badly as the New Inn did, but many would have thought that Jonson's powers were failing. A Tale of a Tub was the last of Jonson's plays to be staged in his lifetime, on this occasion in May 1633 by Queen Henrietta's men at the Cockpit Theatre. It was presented at court the following January, but seems not to have been well received there, which may have been because Jonson ridicules Inigo Jones in the play, and he was still very much in favour at court. The licence for the play specifically mentions that passages satirising Jones in the character of Vitruvius Hoop were to be struck out. Jonson complied, but still included a character called Medley, who fulfills the same function, but in, we assume, a suitably toned-down form. For a long time it was believed that A Tale of a Tub was an early Jonson play, perhaps his very earliest, which he then revised later in life. But more recent scholarship has re-evaluated the play, and now it is thought to have been entirely composed in the period immediately before its first recorded performances. The play is set in the parish of St Pancras, where the activities of the local vicar and the difficulties he faces working with the local governors of the Finsbury area are the main focus of the satire. Apart from the disapproval at court, the play doesn't appear to have run into any particular problems, probably thanks to the fact that Jonson wisely set the play outside of the city, so the aldermen and the governors there could detach themselves from the satire, even if they actually were the intended object. As an employee of the city with his chronologer's job, Jonson was again working with an eye to preserving his income. The play owes much to Plautus and Aristophanes, as it tells the attempts of various suitors to win the hand of Audrey Turf on St Valentine's Day. The play, true to its models, ends with a wedding and a masque, which is also called A Tale of a Tub. At the time, that phrase was equivalent to something like a cock and bull story. Jonson left two incomplete plays, The Sad Shepherd, which was probably a work in progress through 1635. It's a play based on the Robin Hood story and was published in 1641. Mortimer, His Fall, also published in 1641, was to be a history play about Roger Mortimer, who ruled England in all but name after the death of Edward II. The 1641 folio includes just the arguments for the play and the first two scenes of an intended 5-act drama. To the very end, it seems that Jonson was interested in innovating in the theatre. His argument for the play suggests that it would be an attempt to take the historical chronicle form and put it into a more classical frame, using choruses to comment on the action. And there is just one more Jonson play to mention, but it sits a bit outside of any timeline that can be reasonably constructed. Rollo, Duke of Normandy, is a collaboration with John Fletcher, Philip Massinger and George Chapman. The problem with dating the play probably derives from it having been written sometime between 1612 and 1624, and then being revised at some point after 1630, when the names of other playwrights also became connected with it. The earliest recorded performance of the play was at the Globe in May 1633, but there were very probably earlier performances. The play had an afterlife in various published versions where the authorial attribution was amended at different times. The fact that it appears in the second folio of Beaumont and Fletcher's work suggests that they had the biggest hand in it. And just to get a little ahead of ourselves, the play turns up again in the record in 1648. Although the theatres had been officially closed since 1642, some performances did occur under the radar to one degree or another. In 1647, there was a short period of leniency when it came to plays. But in early 1648, the King's Men were arrested for performing King Rollo at the Cockpit Theatre, a clandestine affair which resulted in imprisonment for the actors and the confiscation of their costumes. Ben Jonson, acknowledged as the most famous and respected poet of his age, died on the 16th of August 1637. Crowds of friends and admirers gathered at his home to accompany his body for the short walk to Westminster Abbey, where it was noted at the time that attendance at the funeral service included all or the greater part of the nobility and gentry then in town. As it was the height of summer, many would have been in their country homes to avoid the heat in the city, but still the funeral was an event of national significance. Jonson was what we would now call a celebrity. He was well aware of his position and reportedly asked King Charles for permission to be buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. This conflicts with another story which has him saying to the Dean of Westminster, who was begging him to accept a space in that area, that he was too poor for that, and no one would lay the funeral charges for him. "No, sir, 6 feet long by 2 feet wide is too much for me. 2 feet by 2 feet will do for all I want." "Then you shall have it," said the Dean. So Jonson was buried standing on his feet in the northern end of the nave, not in Poets' Corner. The simple inscription, "O rare Ben Jonson," was said to have been cut at the expense of one Jack Young, who was walking by when the grave was being covered, and gave the mason 18 pence to inscribe it. That inscription has also been ascribed to Sir William Davenant, Jonson's successor as Poet Laureate, on whose own gravestone in the Abbey the words "O rare" also appear. Jonson's original gravestone was moved in the 19th century to the base of the wall opposite the grave, to preserve it when the whole of the nave floor was relaid and many larger gravestones were taken away. His gravesite today is marked with a small grey stone. The inscription is the same as the original stone, though with the H form of the name Jonson. Ben, looking down from above, may not be too pleased about that. In 1849, the area was disturbed by a burial nearby, and the clerk of works saw the 2 leg bones of Jonson's fixed upright in the sand, and the skull came rolling down from its position above the leg bones into the newly made grave. There was still some red hair attached to it. Since his death, Jonson's reputation has not been as consistent as he hoped and expected. In his own opinion, his work would have been revered in the same way that he revered Horace and Ovid and the other classical writers. If he feared that he too would become lost for centuries as they had been, the advent of printing may have allayed that fear. Immediately after his death, and for the next century or so, his poetry continued to be championed by admirers, and his work was seen as filled with wisdom and skill. His style and form of poetry informed the work of first the poets who knew him or lived at the same time, and then by their children and grandchildren. Throughout the 17th century and a little beyond, many writers and poets explicitly modelled their work on Jonson. A decline in interest only came about in the 18th century, and it is difficult to see it as anything else than as inverse to the rise in the popularity of Shakespeare. The 2 great playwrights came to represent opposite ends of the creative spirit, and as Romanticism took hold, the learned Jonson and his closely crafted works did not stand a chance against the naturalness of Shakespeare or his untaught abilities. Jonson's scholarly work was seen as a burden to the originality of his work, and, inevitably, as time passed, the understanding of his highly referential comedies and satiric jibes became very diminished. As satire became generally less well regarded in the 18th century, it is no coincidence that Shakespeare's comedies were also largely ignored and were only rescued by intense scholarship. It took until the 20th century for Jonson's scholarship to be taken as seriously as Shakespeare, but of course it never achieved the same heights in volume at least. The Oxford University Press edition of Jonson's complete works, published in 11 volumes, was started in 1902, with the last volume being published in 1952. Its editors' reviews of primary sources marked it as a change in understanding and appreciation of Jonson, and it remained the bedrock of Jonson's scholarship for decades. The latest complete work, published by Cambridge University Press in 2012, both in print and digital online versions, gives unprecedented access and analysis of Jonson's work. It is a fantastic resource and puts Jonson in a place he deserves to be. To the end, I find that Jonson remains something of an enigma. Even having been immersed in his story for months, I'm not convinced that we ever get to see the true Ben Jonson, and it's not just a paucity of reliable resources that causes that. There can be little doubt that Jonson deliberately manipulated how he wished to be seen, and at times was quite the chameleon. But also, he genuinely played different roles to different patrons and supporters and audiences to his own best advantage. However, at the same time, he couldn't resist being the harshest critic of those same groups, which quite often was to his own detriment. So, was he true to himself in the end and never totally honest with anyone else? Could he compartmentalise in the extreme and somehow justify to himself these apparently conflicting behaviours? I'm still not sure, and that is just one of the reasons why he has been such an interesting character to examine closely. One thing is for sure, by the judgments of his own time, he was the greatest playwright and poet of his time. And although that view was revised by later generations, he is still remembered by posterity for his scholarship, his creativity, and his art. And that is exactly what he wanted and expected. Next time, as it will be Twelfth Night when the next episode is released, it will be a special guest episode all about that special day marking the end of Christmas. And then it will be back to Shakespeare, continuing my look at each of his plays. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or X, just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. There is also now a Blue Sky account for the podcast if X is no longer your thing, so please give that account a follow and say hello. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can also contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.